Hello, greetings from ICMR National Institute of Epidemiology. Welcome to the online e-certificate course, Causal Inference from Observational Studies, abbreviated as COSIT. I'll go through this topic, Overview of Epidemiologic Study Designs. This topic is divided into two sessions. The first, Classification of Epidemiologic Study Designs, and second, Ecologic Studies. Each session is for approximately 10 minutes. In this session, we will go through classification of epidemiologic study designs. Before we go through the session in detail, let us understand the two words that I will be using throughout this session. The two words are exposure and outcome. Exposure variable is also called as independent variable and in common jargon, cause. Outcome variable is also called as dependent variable, in common jargon called as effect. Let me give you some examples. A particular drug is the exposure variable, and the outcome variable could be cure, adverse effects, prevention of disease. Smoking is an exposure variable, while lung cancer is the outcome variable. Family history of smoking is an exposure variable, whereas smoking is an outcome variable. Vaccination could be an exposure variable, while incidence of disease could be an outcome variable. Similarly, any new strategy in a TB program could be an exposure variable, while deaths due to TB could be an outcome variable. Here we need to understand 2 points. That an exposure variable may be a risk factor or it may be a preventive factor. For example, smoking is a risk factor, while vaccination is a preventive factor. The second point to note is that a variable may be an exposure variable in one setting and in another setting it may be an outcome variable. For example, smoking is an exposure variable when we consider smoking and lung cancer. However, smoking here is an outcome variable if we consider family history of smoking and current smoking status. Please note that exposure and outcome will be commonly used during this session, and understanding what is the exposure and what is the outcome is essential when we classify study designs. With this background, let us go through classification of epidemiologic study designs. The first question that we should ask while classifying epidemiologic study designs is this: did the investigator assign exposure? If the investigator assigned exposure, then the study design is an experimental study design. If the investigator did not assign exposure, then the study design is an observational study design. In other words, as a researcher, we are only observing what is happening. Within an experimental study design, depending on whether random allocation was done, it is further classified into randomized control trial and non-randomized control trial. Example of non-randomized control trials would be, say, on every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, the participants are allocated to intervention group, while on every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday, the participants are allocated to control group. This is an example of non-random allocation. Now, let us get back to observational studies. Depending on whether there is a comparison group, the observational studies are classified into analytical studies and descriptive studies. If there is a comparison group where we can infer on association, then the study design is called as analytical study. When there is no comparison group, that is, we cannot infer on association, then the study design is called as descriptive study. Basically, these are single group study, while analytical studies are more than one group studies. Within analytical studies, depending on the direction of measurement of exposure and outcome, these studies are further classified into cross-sectional studies, case control study, and cohort study. In cross-sectional study, exposure and outcome are measured at the same time with reference to the study participant. In case control study, we first measure the outcome and then go back in time to measure the exposure among those with and without the outcome. In cohort study, we start with a cohort of study participant. A cohort means a group of people with a common characteristic. We start with a cohort of study participants and we measure the exposure status at baseline. And after that, we follow these study participants for the development of outcome. Therefore, analytical studies are classified into cross-sectional, case control, and cohort studies, depending on the direction of measurement of exposure and outcome. Now, please note that descriptive studies can also be classified into cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. In longitudinal study, descriptive studies, the measurement is done more than once in the study participant, while in cross-sectional study, the measurement is done only once. So therefore, a descriptive study can also be cross-sectional or longitudinal. As I had mentioned before, exposure and outcome measurements are with respect to study participants' time, not with respect to investigators' time of measurement, not with respect to calendar time. This is very important to understand when we classify epidemiologic study designs. Whenever we mention the study design in the proposal or in the research paper, this is how we describe. We first mention the study design and then follow it up with whether we used primary or secondary data. We have provided some examples below. Cohort study involving secondary data. Cross-sectional study involving primary data. Cohort study involving primary and secondary data. Longitudinal descriptive study involving primary data. These are some examples about how we write study design in our proposal and research papers. Kindly note, we do not use the adjectives retrospective or prospective before the study designs. This is a commonly repeated error. For example, many researchers mention retrospective cohort study. However, retrospective or prospective should not be used as an adjective along with the study design. This is as per recommendations by STROBE guidelines. STROBE refers to strengthening reporting of observational studies in epidemiology. Now, let us go through two scenarios and try to understand what is the study design. This is the first scenario. In this first scenario, the study objective is as follows. Among patients with drug-susceptible TB diagnosed in Chennai under National TB Elimination Program in 2020 to determine the incidence and predictors of TB death. Here, the source of data is secondary data from NICSHARE, which is a web-enabled patient management system for people with TB under National TB Elimination Program. Treatment outcomes among drug-susceptible TB are reported at the end of 1 year. Therefore, for a patient that was diagnosed in December 2020, the treatment outcomes will be available latest by December 2021. Therefore, data was extracted and analyzed in April 2022. So in this scenario, what is the study design? Many make a mistake of mentioning the study design as cross-sectional study design because the exposure and outcome variable were collected at the same time with reference to the investigator's time. They classify the study design as cross-sectional study. However, we discussed before that the classification should be based on measurement of exposure and outcome with reference to study participants' time. Therefore, this study is a cohort study involving secondary data and not a cross-sectional study. Let us look at this second scenario. Among women 15 to 44 years in Chennai, a survey was conducted to determine the mean hemoglobin and prevalence of anemia. Here, the source of data was primary data collected during survey, and the data collection was done between January to June 2022. A common mistake made here is that these kind of studies are classified as longitudinal study designs or cohort study designs because with reference to calendar time, the study data was collected from January to June 2022. However, with reference to the study participant, the outcome data, that is mean hemoglobin and anemia status, was collected only once. Therefore, this is a cross-sectional descriptive study involving primary data, and this is not a longitudinal or cohort study. Thank you very much.